Here's something that will change how you see The Witcher forever. Humans don't belong in Geralt's world. Neither do the monsters. And here's the twist that even long-time fans might have missed. The elves, those ancient beings who claim the continent as their birthright, aren't native either. In fact, there's only one race that truly belongs to this world, and they've been nearly erased from history. 1,500 years before Geralt drew his first breath, reality broke. Not metaphorically, not gradually. The boundaries between dimensions catastrophically failed, and creatures from countless universes found themselves violently thrown together into a single, chaotic world. This wasn't migration. This wasn't conquest. This was existence itself tearing apart at the seams. The conjunction of the spheres. And here's what makes this event so terrifying. Nobody knows what caused it. Nobody knows if it could happen again. And despite 15 centuries of scholarship, the world's greatest mages still argue about whether it was a cosmic accident or something far more sinister. Tonight, we're going to trace the thread of this catastrophe from beginning to end. And along the way, you're going to discover that almost everything you thought you knew about the Witcher's world is built on layers of historical irony. The elves aren't innocent victims. They're colonizers who became colonized. Humans aren't ambitious invaders. They're desperate refugees from a world they destroyed. And monsters, those creatures witchers hunt for coin, are actually other refugees, trapped in a dimension where they were never meant to exist. But before we can understand what the conjunction destroyed, we need to see the world as it was. A world without humans, without monsters, without Geralt, without Ciri, without the witches or the sorceresses, or any of the conflict and magic that defines the series we know. We need to see the age when one forgotten race lived in isolation, completely unaware that their entire reality was about to be invaded by forces beyond comprehension. We need to see the world that was lost. So settle in, dim the lights, and prepare to discover the cosmic catastrophe that explains why everything in The Witcher exists the way it does. This is the story of the conjunction of the spheres, and nothing about The Witcher will seem quite the same once you understand it. Let's begin with a simple question that has a shocking answer. Who actually belongs in this world? The world that was the forgotten first people? The answer is startling. The gnomes. And if you're thinking, wait, gnomes? Then you've already stumbled onto one of the great erasures of history. These small, unassuming beings were the only race that actually evolved on the continent. Every other sapient species, from the proud elves to the conquering humans, came from elsewhere. The gnomes alone can claim this world as their birthright. But here's the tragedy. By the time of Geralt's story, gnomes have been so thoroughly marginalized, so completely pushed aside by wave after wave of arrivals, that most people on the continent don't even remember they existed. The only truly native race has become a forgotten footnote in a history written by colonizers and refugees. Let's go back, far back, to a time when gnomes lived in solitude. Picture a world of rolling hills and ancient forests, of rivers running clean and clear, of skies unblemished by the smoke of war. The gnomes built settlements so integrated with the natural landscape that a traveler might pass through their territories and never realize a civilization thrived there. They cultivated herbs, worked the soil, and lived in harmony with a world that belonged solely to them. They had no concept of the multiverse, no understanding that their reality was just one sphere among countless others, no reason to suspect that their peaceful age was about to end forever. Then came the first outsiders. Between 2,000 and 3,000 years before the conjunction of the spheres, the dwarves arrived. Their origins remain shrouded in mystery, with some texts suggesting they came from a world called Nidavellir, though this might be legend rather than historical fact. What we know for certain is that the dwarves came from somewhere else, making them the first dimensional immigrants to the continent, though by what means they arrived remains unclear. The dwarves came peacefully, seeking new lands to settle, new mountains to mine, new veins of precious metals to work. The gnomes, perhaps recognizing kindred spirits in these stocky, bearded newcomers, reached an understanding with them. Territories were delineated. Trade began. For roughly 1,000 years, these two races coexisted peacefully, gradually shaping the continent into a more hospitable place for civilized beings. The dwarves brought advanced knowledge of metallurgy and stonework. They established great underground cities, with Mahakam becoming their crown jewel, a mountainous homeland that would remain famous for its wealth and craftsmanship, even into Geralt's time. Together, gnomes and dwarves built cities like Tir Toch Nair, centers of learning and craft that would partially survive the millennia to come. Then, approximately 2,500 years before the time of Geralt of Rivia, which places their arrival about 1,000 years before the conjunction, came the elves. And with them came something new to this world: magic. The Insider, as the elves called themselves, arrived on gleaming white ships from lands far to the west, beyond the vast ocean. According to the dwarf Jarpen Zigrin's account in the novels, the elves sailed to the continent on their white vessels roughly 1,000 years before humans first appeared during the conjunction. This timing is significant. It means the elves had approximately a millennium to establish their civilization before the dimensional catastrophe occurred. And here's where we need to clarify something important about magic. Different sources in the Witcher's lore seem to contradict each other about when magic appeared. Some accounts, particularly those found in adaptations like the Gwent card game and The Witcher, Blood Origin, state outright that magic appeared in the world after the conjunction. But this appears to reflect human bias in historical records rather than objective truth. Based on what we can piece together from the most reliable sources, particularly Sapkowski's original novels, magic did exist before the conjunction, but only in limited forms practiced by the elves and, according to fragmentary references, by the mysterious unicorns. What the elves wielded was a form of natural magic, power drawn from the world itself, from living things, from the forces of nature. It was subtle, elegant, and deeply connected to the fabric of reality. What changed after the conjunction was the accessibility and nature of magic. The dimensional catastrophe appears to have weakened barriers not just between spheres, but between the mundane and the magical, making it easier to tap into what humans would learn to call chaos. The aggressive, combat-focused sorcery that human mages would eventually wield was fundamentally different from the older elven tradition. So when humans claim that magic appeared after the conjunction, what they really mean is that the type of magic they practice became possible then. The elves used their magical abilities, combined with superior organization and martial prowess, to establish dominance over the continent. They fought wars with the dwarves over territories and resources. They came into conflict with other races like the Vran and Werabubs, whose own civilizations would eventually be pushed to the margins or destroyed entirely. Through a combination of military might and magical superiority, the elves gradually became the dominant civilization. And here's the first great irony that echoes through everything that follows. The elves, who would later rage against human colonization and cry out against the injustice of being driven from their lands, were themselves colonizers. They conquered through force. They displaced earlier inhabitants. They built their golden age on the ruins of peoples they had defeated or absorbed. The pattern that would later be used against them, they themselves established. For approximately 2,000 years, from their arrival until the conjunction of the spheres, the elves reigned supreme. They built cities of breathtaking beauty, places like Loch Muin, and settlements that would one day be buried beneath human cities like Novigrad and Vizima. They created works of art and philosophy that would never be equaled. They developed a high culture characterized by sophistication, longevity, and absolute confidence in their eternal dominance. The dwarves, proven warriors but pragmatic people, largely retreated to their mountain strongholds like Mahakam, maintaining independence in territories the elves found less desirable. The gnomes faded further into obscurity, their ancient claims to the land forgotten beneath layers of elven cultural dominance. Other races were pushed to the edges of civilization. The elves looked to the future with absolute certainty. Their civilization was at its height. Their magic was unmatched. They built monuments meant to last forever, created art for the ages, saw no reason why their golden age should ever end. They had no way to know that cosmic forces were moving toward a collision that would shatter everything they had built. They had no concept that their world was just one sphere among countless others. They could not imagine that soon, very soon, the boundaries between realities would fail. The year 1500 before the conjunction was approaching, and reality itself was about to break. The cataclysm, when reality tore apart. Now we come to the event itself, and here's something you need to understand. What actually caused the conjunction of the spheres remains one of the greatest mysteries in the Witcher's lore. Scholars have debated for 15 centuries without reaching consensus. Was it a natural phenomenon, a rare cosmic alignment that occurs once in eons? Was it triggered by magical catastrophe, perhaps a spell that went horrifically wrong? Was it deliberate, caused by some being or force that wanted to merge the spheres? The truth is lost, perhaps never known even by those who lived through it. And that uncertainty makes the conjunction even more terrifying, because if we don't know what caused it, we cannot know if it could happen again. What we do know, from fragmentary accounts that survived the chaos, is this: the conjunction began without warning. One moment, the world was as it had always been. The next, reality itself started to fail. Imagine being an elf in one of the great cities, going about your daily business, when suddenly the sky takes on colors that hurt to look at, hues that belong to other worlds bleeding through. The air itself feels wrong, thick and heavy in some places, thin and insubstantial in others. Time becomes unreliable, with some areas experiencing it faster or slower than others. Those most sensitive to magic, the elven sorceresses and the mysterious unicorns, felt it first. They experienced terrible visions, glimpsing other worlds, other realities pressing against their own. Some were driven mad by what they saw. Others fled to places where they hoped the barriers between worlds might be strongest, desperately trying to survive what they sensed was coming. Then the rifts began to open. Across the continent, across multiple worlds simultaneously, tears appeared in the fabric of reality. These weren't small rips or temporary breaches. These were massive, gaping wounds in existence itself, doorways between dimensions that swallowed everything near them and disgorged creatures and objects from other spheres. The rifts appeared randomly, without pattern or warning. One might open in the middle of an elven city, another in a trackless forest, a third beneath the waves of the ocean. And through these rifts came the invasions. But here's the crucial thing to understand. This wasn't an organized attack. There was no grand plan, no invading army with a unified purpose. What came through the rifts were refugees, displaced beings, creatures from countless different realities, all being thrown together by forces none of them understood or controlled. Some came willingly, diving through portals in desperate bids to escape whatever catastrophe was befalling their own worlds. Others were pulled through against their will, dragged by forces they could neither understand nor resist. Still others simply found themselves suddenly displaced, one moment in their home world, and the next in a reality so fundamentally different they could barely comprehend what had happened. The conjunction affected not just 2 or 3 worlds, but potentially hundreds of different spheres across dimensions that humans cannot even conceptualize. Visualize it like a cosmic storm striking a sea of realities, tossing the spheres against each other like ships in a hurricane. At the height of the catastrophe, multiple realities were essentially overlapping, their boundaries so thoroughly compromised that beings could cross between them with terrible ease. According to a book that can be found in The Witcher 3, Wild Hunt, written by a human historian named Adam Nivell. Centuries after the event, the conjunction has been compared to a storm upon a cosmic sea that tosses ships or worlds against each other, allowing crew and cargo to move between vessels. Nivell, who preferred to call the event "When the Worlds Collided," compared the creatures that came through to passengers from another ship, while humans were castaways, flung against our will from somewhere far away onto a world previously inhabited by the elder races. For the elves watching this unfold from their great cities, it must have seemed like the apocalypse. Their ordered, comprehensible reality was being invaded by forces they could not fight or even understand. Creatures they had no names for, monsters that defied all classification, suddenly manifested in their streets and countryside. Magic itself became unpredictable, with spells that had worked reliably for centuries suddenly producing unexpected results or failing entirely. The conjunction was not a brief event. Historical evidence suggests it lasted for an extended period, with the most intense dimensional instability continuing for decades or possibly even centuries. During this time, the rifts would open and close unpredictably, disgorging new waves of displaced beings at irregular intervals. Entire generations lived and died during the chaos, never knowing a time when reality was stable. And here's what makes this even more terrifying. When the conjunction finally ended, when the boundaries between spheres somehow began to reassert themselves and the rifts closed, everyone and everything that had come through was permanently trapped. There would be no going home for the refugees from destroyed worlds. There would be no returning to their original dimensions for the monsters. The spheres had separated again, and those caught in the wrong reality when it happened were stranded forever. The world would never be the same. Too many beings from other realities had already come through. Too much had already changed. The world of the elder races, the ordered civilization they had built over millennia, was gone. Replaced by something new, something dangerous, something that would require entirely different ways of living to survive. Now let's meet the newcomers. Let's see exactly what came through those dimensional rifts during the conjunction of the spheres. The monsters, refugees from dead worlds. When we talk about monsters in The Witcher, we're not talking about mindless beasts or demonic entities. We're talking about living beings from other dimensions, creatures that evolved in radically different environments according to radically different rules, now finding themselves trapped in a world where they don't belong and cannot easily survive. These creatures came from multiple different spheres. Some came from worlds of darkness and blood, others from dimensions where the laws of nature operated in completely alien ways. They were not a unified force. They had no common origin, no shared agenda. They were refugees or invaders, or victims of circumstance, depending on your perspective, all finding themselves in the same alien world. Let's start with perhaps the most significant arrival, the vampires. And here's where we need to correct a massive misconception. Vampires in The Witcher are not undead. They are not transformed humans cursed with supernatural hunger. They are not created by biting. Vampires are an entirely separate species. Born as vampires, living beings with their own biology and culture who evolved in a reality very different from the continent. During the conjunction, all vampire subspecies, from lesser creatures like fleedas and echimas to the incredibly rare higher vampires, came through the dimensional rifts from their own sphere. They found themselves suddenly stranded in a world full of potential prey, but also full of beings who would quickly learn to hunt them. Now here's a revelation from The Witcher 3's Blood and Wine expansion that many fans miss. Higher vampires descended from 3 ancient tribes that arrived on the continent during the conjunction. These tribes established themselves in different regions, adapting to their new world in different ways. Some higher vampires chose to integrate into other races' societies, living secretly among humans or elves. Others retreated to isolated places, forming hidden communities. Still others gave in to predatory instincts, becoming the fearsome monsters of legend. Higher vampires are truly immortal. They can regenerate from even the most grievous injuries given sufficient time. The only way to permanently kill a higher vampire is for another higher vampire to do it. This makes them among the most powerful beings in the entire Witcher universe. When Regis, the higher vampire who accompanies Geralt in the novels, was decapitated, staked, doused with holy water, and buried, he still regenerated decades later. That's the level of power we're discussing. But here's what makes higher vampires particularly interesting. For them, blood isn't necessary for survival. According to Regis's own account in the novels, blood for vampires is like alcohol for humans, something consumed for the experience it provides, rather than out of biological necessity. In one passage, Regis even calculates that if the approximately 2,200 higher vampires that came through during the conjunction each drank blood once per full moon, that would result in roughly 26,400 people being bitten each year. Yet humans didn't turn into vampires because that's not how it works. Lesser vampires, however, do require blood to survive, making them constant threats. The Fleedas, Bruxae, Catacans, and other lesser vampire species developed reputations as dangerous monsters, creatures that had to be hunted to keep populations safe. Vampires possess several unusual properties that even they don't fully understand. They cast no shadows and produce no reflections. They cannot be harmed by traditional vampire deterrents like holy water, garlic, or crucifixes, these being merely superstitions that developed later. Silver is largely ineffective against them. Sunlight doesn't destroy them, though many prefer to avoid it since their lack of shadow would make them conspicuous. Now let's talk about the necrophages. Ghouls, gravers, alguls, and other carrion feeders found themselves in a new world where death, especially violent death, would become increasingly common in the years following the conjunction. These creatures are driven primarily by hunger and the instinct to feed on corpses. They gravitate toward battlefields, graveyards, and any place where death has occurred. Necrophages, despite their relatively simple nature, proved to be a persistent problem. They reproduce quickly, adapt readily to new environments, and have an uncanny ability to find corpses even when hidden. In times of war or plague, when death rates soar, necrophage populations explode, creating crisis situations. Then there are the beasts, griffins, basilisks, and cockatrices. These predators had no natural enemies in this new world. A griffin, with its combination of lion's strength and eagle's aerial capabilities, could dominate vast territories. These creatures evolved in dimensions with very different ecosystems, and they found the fauna of the continent to be easy prey. Leshens, ancient forest spirits from a world where nature itself was. Conscious and often hostile, brought a different kind of threat. These creatures could control the forests they inhabited, commanding animals and plants alike, creating zones where other races couldn't safely travel. Ogroids include trolls, and other hulking beings from dimensions where such massive forms were common. Some trolls proved capable of learning language and living peacefully near other races. Others remained violent and territorial, attacking anyone who entered their domains. Each species of monster brought its own challenges. Drowners and drowned, dead-haunted bodies of water. Foglets lurked in mists and swamps. Harpies ruled certain skies. Arachnomorphs infested caves and ruins. And here's the crucial point that explains everything about the monster situation in The Witcher. These creatures have no ecological niche in the world of the elder races. They are, as one in-game text describes them, relics of bygone times, refugees from dimensions that no longer connect to this one. They don't fit into existing food chains. They often cannot reproduce naturally in this environment, or reproduce so slowly that their populations remain relatively stable. They are, in a very real sense, living fossils from other realities. For the elder races, completely unprepared for this onslaught, the early days following the conjunction were catastrophic. Elven cities found themselves besieged by creatures they had no knowledge of how to fight. Dwarven strongholds, thought to be impregnable, were breached by monsters that could dig through solid rock or fly over fortifications. Gnome settlements simply vanished, their inhabitants killed or scattered. But as terrible as the monster invasions were, they were not the most significant arrival during the conjunction of the spheres. Something else came through those dimensional rifts, something that would ultimately prove even more transformative than any vampire or beast. Humans had arrived, and they brought with them a revelation that would change everything. Humanity's arrival, the refugees from a dead world. Among all the beings that came through the dimensional rifts, none would have a more profound impact than humanity. But here's what you need to understand. Humans didn't arrive as conquerors. They arrived as desperate refugees, fleeing from a world they themselves had destroyed. According to The Witcher's most reliable sources, particularly statements from the NL elf Avalak in The Witcher 3, humans came from a world that had been ruined before the conjunction. The exact nature of this catastrophe is never fully detailed, but the implication is clear. Humanity destroyed their own world through war, environmental collapse, magical disaster, or some combination thereof. When the conjunction opened rifts between dimensions, humans didn't choose to colonize a new world. They fled through the rifts because they had nowhere else to go. The first humans to arrive during the height of the conjunction were not the Nordlings who would later establish the northern kingdoms. They were earlier waves belonging to cultures known as the Dauk and Vosgor peoples. These first humans were survivors of apocalypse, refugees adapting to an utterly alien world. Imagine what this must have been like. One moment, you're in your own world, perhaps fighting in its final wars or fleeing its final catastrophes. The next, you're falling through cosmic rifts into a reality where nothing makes sense. The stars are wrong. The air tastes different. Creatures from nightmares walk beside you, having come through from still other worlds. And surrounding you, watching with mixtures of curiosity and horror, are the elder races. Peoples who look vaguely similar to humans, but are fundamentally different in culture and capability. The early days of humanity on the continent were a desperate struggle for survival. The humans who came through during the conjunction found themselves in a world already filled with monsters, with no safe havens, no established communities, no resources beyond what they could carry or quickly gather. They had to learn about this new world, while simultaneously fighting for their lives against creatures they'd never seen before, in an environment they didn't understand. But humans possessed certain advantages that would prove crucial. They were adaptable in ways that the long-lived elder races were not. They reproduced quickly compared to elves, whose fertility declined after only a brief period of their long lives. And most significantly, they discovered they could learn to harness the chaotic magic that had become more prevalent after the conjunction. Now, here's where things get interesting. According to elven accounts, particularly as related in the novels and expanded upon in the games, humans during the conjunction learned to manipulate what they would come to call chaos. This was fundamentally different from the older, nature-based magic the elves had practiced before the conjunction. The first human to truly master this chaotic magic, according to legend, was Jan Becker. Whether this was an actual historical figure or a composite of multiple early human mages remains debated. But what matters is that human magic users learned to tap into chaos and bend it to their will. They taught others, and from these teachings came the foundations of what would later become formal magical schools and traditions. Human magic was more aggressive than elven sorcery, more focused on combat and transformation, less concerned with harmony and tradition. Human mages proved to be quick learners and innovators, developing new spells and techniques. This access to powerful magic gave early humans a fighting chance against the monsters and, later, against the elder races themselves. Over the centuries following the conjunction, human populations slowly grew. They established settlements, mostly small and scattered, wherever they could find land not dominated by the elder races or too heavily infested with monsters. These early human communities were rough, desperate places populated by people who had to be fighters and survivors first, and anything else second. But humans also proved capable of organization on scales that surprised the elder races. Human leaders emerged who could unite multiple communities. Small kingdoms began to form, growing steadily as populations increased and resources were consolidated. The elves watched this with growing concern, but didn't act decisively. Some scholars believe the elves, thinking in terms of thousands of years given their long lifespans, assumed that human kingdoms would prove temporary, that short-lived humans would squabble among themselves and eventually decline. They fundamentally misunderstood human nature and the threat humanity represented. For approximately 1,000 years after the conjunction of the spheres, this was the state of things. A much-reduced elven civilization still dominant in many regions. Dwarves holding their mountain kingdoms, gnomes nearly forgotten, monsters infesting the wilderness, and humans slowly, steadily growing in numbers and power. Then, around 500 years before the time of Geralt of Rivia, approximately 1,000 years after the conjunction itself, something happened that would tip the balance decisively in humanity's favor. A new wave of humans arrived. But this time, they came not through dimensional rifts, but by sea. And unlike the desperate refugees of the conjunction, these humans came as colonizers. The first landing had begun. The first landing, when colonizers arrived. The humans who came through during the conjunction, the Dauk and Wozgor peoples, were survivors adapting to an alien world. The humans who came with the first landing were something very different. The Nordlings, aggressive colonizers actively seeking new lands to claim. Around the year 760, by the calendar system that would later be established, approximately 1,000 years after the conjunction of the spheres, 4 ships crossed the vast ocean to the west. They made landfall at the mouth of 2 great rivers, the Pontar Delta and the mouth of the Yaruga. These locations would become the northern and southern boundaries of what would eventually be known as the Northern Kingdoms, the primary setting for Geralt's stories. We don't know exactly where these Nordling ships came from. the legends are remarkably silent on this crucial detail. Based on what we can infer from scattered references, they may have been descendants of the original human refugees who had established colonies elsewhere in the world and were now returning to the continent with greater numbers and better organization. But this remains speculation. What we know for certain is that these Nordlings were distinctly different from the earlier human populations. Where the conjunction refugees had been broken survivors, the Kant, Nordlings were confident expansionists. Where earlier humans had learned to accept whatever the elder races would allow them, the Nordlings had no intention of accepting subservient status. They came to conquer, to build, to establish kingdoms. Among the Nordlings who came ashore was a mage named Jan Becker. Whether this was the same legendary Jan Becker who supposedly mastered chaos magic during the conjunction, or a descendant bearing the same name, or simply a mythological figure whose actual identity is lost, remains unclear. What matters is that this Jan Becker possessed formidable magical ability and immediately set about exploiting the magical forces present on the continent. The Nordlings established their first settlement quickly, within days of landfall. They were efficient, organized, and well prepared, bringing knowledge of construction, agriculture, and social organization that allowed them to create a functional community far faster than the conjunction refugees had managed. For several hundred years, the expansion of Nordling humans went largely unnoticed, or at least unopposed by the elder races. The elves, still recovering from the post-conjunction era, didn't initially see these new humans as a significant threat. After all, humans had been present for 1,000 years without seriously challenging elven dominance. Why should these new arrivals be different? This was a catastrophic miscalculation. The Nordlings reproduced rapidly. Within just a few generations, their populations swelled to numbers rivaling or exceeding elven populations in many regions. They were also far more aggressive about expanding territories, clearing forests for farmland, establishing new settlements, and pressing ever eastward into lands the elves considered their own. Critically, Nordling mages quickly became formidable practitioners. They developed formal schools and traditions, systematizing magical knowledge in ways that made it more accessible and replicable. Where elven magic was often individualistic, passed down through apprenticeships, Nordling magic became almost industrial, with academies producing competent mages at rates the elves couldn't match. Around the year 782, just over 20 years after the first landing, the first major confrontation occurred. An army led by a human warrior named Ludovic brought down the elven kingdom of Devethaf and took control of Toussaint. This was the first time humans successfully conquered an established elven kingdom, and it sent shockwaves through both societies. The conquest of Devethaf proved that humans could defeat elves militarily, that elven civilization wasn't invincible, that the age of elven dominance was ending. For the Nordlings, it was validation. For the elves, it was the beginning of a long, agonizing decline. And here's where the great irony becomes unavoidable. The elves' response to this first major defeat was to retreat and negotiate, hoping that human expansion would eventually stop on its own. They signed peace treaties, established boundaries, tried to accommodate these colonizers as if they were reasonable partners rather than existential threats. The pattern the elves had used against the gnomes and dwarves, the pattern of conquest and displacement, was now being used against them. And they were making exactly the same mistakes the races they'd conquered had made. Underestimating the threat, negotiating when they should have fought, retreating when they should have resisted. The wars that followed would last for centuries, and the outcome was never really in doubt. Let me show you why humanity was always going to win. The human-elven wars. The pattern repeats. The centuries following the first landing saw a series of conflicts that would completely reshape the continent. These weren't single wars with clear beginnings and endings, but rather ongoing campaigns punctuated by false peaces and broken treaties, a slow but inexorable process of human expansion and elven retreat. And here's the pattern. Humans would settle in areas the elves considered marginal. These settlements would grow. Eventually, humans would move to claim more territory, often by force. The elves would resist, battles would be fought, and almost invariably, the elves would be forced to retreat further east. The cycle would repeat. But why did humans keep winning? The elves were longer lived, more experienced, and possessed ancient magical knowledge. They had established civilizations, built cities, and dominated the continent for 2,000 years. How did humans, relative newcomers, manage to defeat them so thoroughly? The answer lies in several factors working together. First, the sheer speed of human reproduction gave them an insurmountable advantage. A human woman might bear a dozen children in her lifetime. An elven woman might bear 2 or 3 across centuries. This meant human populations could recover from devastating losses within a generation. Elven casualties were permanent setbacks taking centuries to replace. Second, humans brought a different mindset to warfare. They fought with a brutality and willingness to accept losses that shocked the elves. Human commanders would spend lives freely if it meant gaining victory. Accepting casualty rates, elven commanders found unconscionable. Third, human battle magic, while perhaps less elegant than elven sorcery, proved devastatingly effective in combat. Human mages developed spells specifically designed to kill efficiently. In chaotic battles, this aggressive approach to magic proved decisive. Fourth, humans proved adept at learning from everyone they encountered. They adopted dwarven metallurgy, studied elven architecture, learned about the continent's ecology, and used all this knowledge to wage more effective campaigns. The elves, secure in their ancient knowledge, often failed to adapt. Finally, humans were united by common goals in ways the elder races weren't. Different elven kingdoms often failed to coordinate responses, sometimes even continuing old rivalries. Humans, meanwhile, recognized their continued expansion depended on supporting each other. The result was predictable. Many elven cities, centers of culture that had stood for millennia, fell to human conquest. And here's the dark part. The humans didn't preserve these monuments to elven civilization. They systematically destroyed them. Elven libraries were burned, artwork looted or destroyed, architectural marvels torn down, and their stones repurposed for human construction. The northern kingdoms that emerged built their major cities, places like Vizima and Novigrad, directly atop the ruins of elven settlements, quite literally burying elven civilization beneath human foundations. If you play The Witcher 3, every time you explore elven ruins, you're seeing evidence of this deliberate cultural destruction. The dwarves, watching the fall of the elves, made the pragmatic choice to negotiate rather than fight. Secure in mountain strongholds like Mahakam, they agreed to trade relationships, exchanged goods and knowledge, and generally sought accommodation. This meant dwarven civilization survived, though at the cost of ceding most lowlands to human control. The gnomes essentially vanished from history during this period. By Geralt's time, they're barely remembered, reduced to footnotes in historical texts. One event particularly illustrates the tragedy of this era: the tale of Lara Doran and Cregennan of Lod. Lara was an elven sorceress with elder blood, rare magical ability. Cregennan was a human sorcerer of tremendous power. Against all cultural norms and amid raging war, they fell in love. For a brief time, their relationship symbolized the possibility of peace. They proved the races could coexist, could even love each other despite differences. Some pointed to them as evidence the war was unnecessary. Then tragedy struck. The couple was ambushed near a place called Foam. Cregennan was murdered. Lara, pregnant with his child, fled, but found herself wounded and alone. She desperately sought help, eventually reaching the carriage of Queen Tero of Redania. What happened next depends on who tells the story. According to human accounts, Lara tried to curse the queen and had to be driven away. According to elven accounts, Lara begged not for her own life, but for mercy for her unborn child, and the queen responded by ordering Lara's fingers cut off when she grabbed the carriage door. Lara died that night in the forest, giving birth to a daughter she protected with the last of her warmth. The child, Rhiannon, was found and adopted by Queen Tero, growing up in the Redanian court. Ironically, she would become an ancestor of Ciri, the child of elder blood, whose story drives the Witcher saga. The death of Lara Dorren became a rallying cry for both sides, each interpreting events to justify continued conflict. The tragedy that might have brought the races together drove them further apart. The wars continued for centuries. Peace treaties were signed and broken repeatedly, each time with the elves ceding more territory, accepting worse terms, acknowledging their declining power. Around the year 1060, a young elf named Eileren led what would be the last major elven uprising against human rule. Against the advice of her elders, who knew the revolt was doomed, Eileren gathered an army of young elves tired of human domination and marched against the northern kingdoms. The battle that followed was less a military engagement than a massacre. Eileren and every warrior who followed her died. The failure of Eileren's revolt marked the effective end of elven military resistance. What remained of elven civilization was broken, scattered, reduced to living in reservations, ghettos, and isolated mountain communities. The elves who survived did so by accepting human supremacy, living as a discriminated minority in lands that had been theirs for 2,000 years. By the 13th century, when most of the Witcher's stories take place, elves faced discrimination, violence, and frequent pogroms. The sophisticated civilization that had dominated the continent for millennia had been reduced to poverty, marginalization, and constant fear. And here's the final, bitter irony. The elves, who had conquered the gnomes and dwarves centuries before, who had built their golden age on the displacement of earlier peoples, became victims of the same pattern they themselves had established. The colonizers were colonized. The conquerors were conquered. History's wheel had turned, and the elves found themselves on the receiving end of precisely the treatment they had once inflicted on others. This was the world the conjunction of the spheres had ultimately created, a continent dominated by humans who arrived as refugees and became conquerors, with the ancient elder races reduced to marginalized minorities, and with monsters from other dimensions still haunting the wilderness. And into this world came one final consequence of the conjunction, one last adaptation to the monster-infested reality the dimensional catastrophe had created. Into this world came the Witchers, the birth of the Witchers, creating monsters to fight. Monsters, the decision to create Witchers came from desperation. For centuries after the conjunction, all the peoples of the continent struggled against monster populations. Professional monster hunters existed from the earliest days, brave individuals who learned to track and kill dangerous creatures. But these early hunters were fundamentally limited. They were normal humans or elves with normal capabilities. Against lesser monsters, they might prevail. Against higher vampires and the most powerful beasts, they often died. By the time humans had established their kingdoms, roughly 200 to 300 years after the first landing, the monster problem had become critical. Human expansion into new territories brought settlers into contact with monster populations in the wilderness. The wars between humans and elves, with their constant toll of dead, had caused necrophage populations to explode. The need for more effective monster hunters became undeniable. The solution came from a collaboration between human rulers and mages. If normal humans couldn't effectively fight the most dangerous monsters, then perhaps humans could be modified. Perhaps, through magic and alchemy, humans could be transformed into something designed specifically for killing monsters. The exact origins of the first Witcher schools are lost to history. We know that multiple groups of mages, sponsored by various kingdoms and working independently, developed similar processes. We know these early experiments were often disastrous, producing monsters as often as heroes. We know that eventually, after tremendous effort and countless deaths, the process was refined. The key innovation was the trial of the grasses, an alchemical process that fundamentally altered human biology. Young boys, typically around 10 years old, would be subjected to a series of mutagens and viral cultures that broke down normal human physiology and rebuilt it into something enhanced. And here's the horror of it. The process had a survival rate of only 3 or 4 out of every 10 subjects. The rest died in agony, their bodies unable to withstand the transformations being forced upon them. Historical records don't sugarcoat this. The creation of witches was built on piles of children's corpses. Those who survived gained superhuman abilities. Their reflexes became supernaturally fast. Their strength increased significantly. Their senses, particularly vision, became dramatically enhanced, with distinctive cat-like eyes that could see in near total darkness. They gained immunity to most diseases and resistance to poisons. They developed accelerated healing and extended lifespans, potentially spanning centuries. But these enhancements came at terrible costs. Witches became sterile, unable to have children. They developed emotional detachment, finding it difficult to feel the full range of human emotions. Society viewed them with fear and suspicion, seeing them as mutants, freaks, something not quite human despite their origins. And they bore physical scars of transformation, the cat eyes and pale skin marking them as different, as other. Multiple Witcher schools developed, each with its own traditions and specializations. The School of the Wolf, based in the fortress of Kaer Morhen, would eventually produce Geralt. The School of the Cat developed methods for creating female witches, though the survival rate for women was even lower, only 1 in 10. The School of the Griffin emphasized magical training. The School of the Bear focused on raw power. Other schools developed their own reputations. For approximately 200 years, from roughly 1100 to 1300 witches, represented humanity's primary defense against monster populations. They wandered the continent, taking contracts to hunt dangerous creatures, earning coin for their services. They were respected for their effectiveness, but feared for their differences. And here's the tragic irony. Their very success doomed their profession. As monsters became rarer, the need for witches declined. People questioned why they should pay for protection against diminishing threats. Attitudes shifted from grudging respect to active hostility. In the 1230s, a pogrom against Kaer Morhen resulted in the destruction of the fortress and deaths of most witches based there. More critically, the knowledge of how to perform the trial of the grasses was lost. The few surviving witches could no longer create successors. Other schools faced similar attacks or simply faded as their members died. By the time of Geralt, in the 1260s and 1270s, witches were a dying breed. No new witches were being created. The old ones were gradually being killed by monsters or dying of old age. Geralt himself was among the last, one of perhaps a few dozen witches still active across the entire continent. Yet the profession left an indelible mark. Witches became legends, their deeds celebrated in songs, even as the real individuals faced discrimination and poverty. The very existence of witches stood as permanent testament to how profoundly the conjunction had altered the world. 1,500 years after dimensional rifts closed, the world still needed mutant monster hunters. 1,500 years later, the consequences of that cosmic catastrophe were still shaping daily life. 1,500 years later, Geralt of Rivia walked the path, hunting creatures that never should have existed, in a world that had been forever changed by forces no one truly understood. The legacy. A world still haunted 1,500 years after the conjunction of the spheres, every aspect of life on the continent traces back to that cosmic catastrophe. And here's what makes this particularly fascinating. The world is still actively experiencing consequences of the conjunction. Monster populations, though reduced from their peaks, remain constant presences. Necrophages still gather wherever death occurs in numbers. Lesser vampires still hunt human prey. Beasts still claim wilderness territories. The creatures that came through from other dimensions have become naturalized, no less belonging here than the humans who also arrived from elsewhere. Magic, particularly the chaotic sorcery practiced by human mages, exists as a direct consequence of the conjunction. The dimensional catastrophe weakened barriers not just between spheres, but between the mundane and magical. The Brotherhood of Sorcerers, magical schools, the entire infrastructure of institutional magic, all stems from humans learning to harness chaos that became more accessible after the conjunction. The racial tensions defining so much of the Witcher's conflicts trace directly back to the conjunction. Humans arrived as refugees, learned magic from elves who tried to help them, then turned that knowledge against their teachers in wars of conquest. The resulting bitterness, the centuries of violence and discrimination, the mutual suspicion and hatred between humans and non-humans, all grows from that initial arrival. The political landscape reflects the post-conjunction order. The northern kingdoms, built on elven ruins, represent human triumph over the elder races. The Nilfgaardian Empire to the south, a different branch of humanity with partially elven heritage, demonstrates how completely humans came to dominate. The few remaining enclaves of elder races, like Mahakam and Dol Blathana, exist as small holdouts of pre-conjunction civilization. And here's the revelation that brings everything together. In The Witcher 3, Wild Hunt, a second conjunction of the spheres occurs. During the game's events, set in motion by Ciri's attempts to stop the White Frost, the boundaries between spheres weaken again. Monsters begin appearing on the island of Undvik. The rifts start to open once more, though on a much smaller scale than the original conjunction. This second conjunction is far more limited, affecting smaller areas for shorter periods. But it demonstrates something crucial. The fundamental vulnerability in reality's fabric still exists. The conjunction of the spheres wasn't a one-time accident. It was evidence of an ongoing instability in the multiverse itself. The second conjunction also facilitated the departure of many the elves from the continent. A gate called Ardgaith opened on the Great Sea, allowing elves to flee the human-dominated world for other spheres. Not all survived the journey, with many ships lost to storms or destroyed by unknown monsters. But those who made it through potentially found new worlds where they might rebuild. In this way, the story comes full circle. The conjunction brought races together by force. The second conjunction allowed some to separate again, fleeing a world that no longer wanted them. The elves, who had once dominated the continent as colonizers, left as refugees, completing a historical arc that began with their own arrival on white ships thousands of years before. And the monoliths scattered across the landscape? Those mysterious stone structures connected to the conjunction? According to The Witcher, blood origin. They were buried by dwarves before the elves even arrived, potentially making them unimaginably ancient. Yet they served as portals during the conjunction and can still be activated by those with sufficient power, like Ciri with her elder blood. This suggests something profound. The conjunction wasn't random. The infrastructure for dimensional travel existed before the catastrophe occurred. Whether the monoliths were designed to facilitate travel or to prevent it, whether they failed in their purpose or succeeded, in some way we don't understand, remains one of the great mysteries. The mystery endures. For all we know about the conjunction of the spheres, fundamental questions remain unanswered. What caused it? Was it natural or deliberate? Could it happen again? What were the monoliths originally built for? How many spheres merged during the catastrophe? What happened to the human world that was destroyed? These questions have no certain answers. The accounts that survive from that era are fragmentary, contradictory, and heavily biased. Elven histories present one version, human chronicles another, and truth likely lies somewhere between or beyond either account. And perhaps that's fitting. The conjunction was, by its nature, an incomprehensible event, something that broke normal rules and defied normal understanding. That it should remain partially mysterious, even 15 centuries later, seems appropriate. But here's what we can say with certainty. The conjunction of the spheres reshaped reality in ways that continue to define existence on the continent. It brought together peoples and creatures from multiple dimensions, forcing them to coexist in a single world. It created opportunities for new forms of magic, new types of beings, new ways of living. It drove the creation of witches, institutions, and political structures that shape events 1,500 years later. The world Geralt inhabits exists as a direct result of that cosmic catastrophe. Every monster he fights descends from creatures that came through dimensional rifts. Every magical spell uses forces made accessible by the conjunction. Every conflict between human and non-human echoes displacements and conquests that followed humanity's arrival. Conclusion: the thread that connects everything. And so we return to where we began, but with understanding now. The conjunction of the spheres wasn't merely background lore. It was the transformative event that created the world as Geralt knows it. From a peaceful world inhabited by gnomes alone, through waves of immigration by dwarves and elves, through dimensional catastrophe bringing monsters and humans, through centuries of war and adaptation, through the creation of witches to fight creatures that shouldn't exist. The story of the conjunction is the story of how the world came to need someone like Geralt of Rivia. Every time Geralt walks the path, every time he draws his silver sword against a monster, he embodies the legacy of the conjunction. He is a response to a catastrophe that occurred 1,500 years before his birth, a mutant created to fight refugees from dead worlds, navigating conflicts rooted in ancient displacements. The monsters he fights are trapped here by circumstances beyond their control. The humans who hire him are descendants of refugees who became colonizers. The elves who sometimes need his help are former colonizers who became victims of the same pattern they established. The magic he uses draws on forces made accessible by dimensional catastrophe. The discrimination he faces stems from humanity's desperate solution to the monster crisis. Understanding the conjunction gives context to everything in The Witcher. It explains why the world is as it is, why certain prejudices persist, why monsters exist, why witches were created. It reveals the layers of historical irony, the patterns that repeat, the way victims become victimizers who become victims again. And here's the final revelation, the twist that recontextualizes everything. In a sense, everyone in the Witcher's world is a monster. Not morally, but literally. Humans, elves, dwarves, vampires, necrophages, beasts. They're all creatures that don't belong in the world where they found themselves. The gnomes alone had claim to this reality, and they're nearly extinct, forgotten by races of immigrants and refugees who came to dominate a world that was never meant to hold them. The real monster, the real villain of the Witcher's world, is the conjunction itself. That cosmic catastrophe that threw beings from countless realities into a single, overcrowded world. That dimensional failure that created a situation where survival required displacement, where thriving required conquest, where peace was never truly possible because there were always too many peoples competing for too little space. Geralt hunts monsters, but he lives in a world created by the greatest monster of all, chaos itself, reality breaking down, the multiverse failing in its fundamental purpose of keeping different worlds separate and distinct. And the terrifying truth? It could happen again. The second conjunction proved that. The barriers between worlds are still weak. The infrastructure for dimensional travel still exists. The forces that caused the first conjunction, whatever they were, might still be active. So the next time you play The Witcher 3, the next time you watch the series, remember this. Everyone is an immigrant, a refugee, or a descendant thereof. Everyone arrived from somewhere else, whether through ships or through dimensional rifts. Everyone is just trying to survive in a world that was never meant to hold so many different kinds of beings. And Geralt, the mutant witcher hunting monsters for coin, represents the ultimate irony. He's a human modified into something not quite human anymore, hunting creatures that don't belong in this world, all because of a cosmic catastrophe that nobody truly understands, working for people who themselves are refugees from another dimension. That's the legacy of the conjunction of the spheres. That's the foundation of everything in the Witcher's universe. That's the cosmic catastrophe that explains why Geralt must walk the path. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the deepest lore of the Witcher's universe. If you enjoyed this exploration of the conjunction of the spheres and the historical ironies that shape Geralt's world, please consider subscribing to Sleepable Gaming Lore for more deep dives into the stories, histories, and mysteries of your favorite games. Until next time, sleep well. And remember, in the Witcher's world, everyone's a monster. It's just that some monsters hunt other monsters for coin.